We're jumping the last stretch. It's been an incredible but long day, and now is the kind of special moment because it's really a great pleasure and honor to welcome Timothy Mitchell as our keynote speaker today. Tim generously agreed to speak, and we promised that given the long day, we would open it up rapidly to conversation. Let's see how much stamina you have, and all of you. Tim is a professor and chair of the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. He joined Columbia in 2008 after teaching for 25 years at NYU, where he served as director of the Center of Near Eastern Studies. His work operates across disciplines from political theory, anthropology, history, postcolonial studies, and political geography. He is the author of Colonizing Egypt from 1991, Rule of Experts, Egypt, Technopolitics, Modernity in 2002, and more recently, Carbon Democracy, Political Power, and the Age of Oil that came out in 2011. Professor Mitchell's writings are at the core of the learning experience of every student of the Arab region's history and politics, and here at GSAP, his writing is always a sharp turn or interruption in my own seminar on the evolution of Arab cities. From his seminal essay, The Stage of Modernity, which invites us to all finally abandon any notion of a local that is original, authentic, or pure, in contrast to or outside of the global, to his thinking in Carbon Democracy, in which Tim offers us the concept of Jihad, again undermining the constructed opposition between local identities and global capital, and instead demonstrating how the two are intimately intertwined as they mobilize one another. Today, Tim, I suspect, or we'll see, will invite us maybe to move away from questions of symbolic representation and identity to the question of capitalization, with global urban development as a prime example of this process. We're really honored again to have with us Professor Timothy Mitchell. Please join me in welcoming him warmly.
Thank you, Amale, and thank you, Nora, for the, let me get the microphone back, for that very warm welcome. I wrote quite extensively around questions of representation, including architectural representation, but I haven't done so for some time. It's almost a decade since I've written about these questions. I'm trying to resist the feeling that I'm like Mohammed's prisoner let out after 10 years, and briefly taking a glimpse of how the city looks now before I head back to the prison again this evening. You remember from the talk this morning, that Cairo prisoner. This was billed as a keynote, but I hope we can think of it more as an end note, a small set of comments to close things off, especially as we've all been here for a very long time. So this prison metaphor works obviously both ways, and illustrates how easy it is to escape the burden of representation, as it's called, or perhaps not, just to illustrate its multiplicity and how it comes to haunt us again and again. And of course that's been the theme throughout the day, of how we do either suspend or in various ways subvert that burden. And I myself have found enormously illuminating the chance to see the variety of ways in which, particularly in contemporary architectural practice, that is done and done in such imaginative and interesting ways. So I don't want to sort of be like the architectural critic or historian, the one sort of forcing the practitioner back into a theoretical question of representation. And I'm not going to do that, as Amale suggested in a certain way. I've been thinking about other things over the last decade, but they are things that actually, I think, help us think about representation, because the things I've been thinking about, which one might put under the term of the material, the return to the material that Reinhold mentioned this morning. I think they offer us a way to think about questions of meaning, of signification, of representation, where we can do so in a way that doesn't get us trapped into thinking of oppositions between material and representational, but can think about all the ways in which forms of inscription, forms of writing, forms of meaning are enfolded into every kind of work that, every kind of public work that is done, and that one isn't going to make sense of that big question of representation if one continues sort of asks it with a big R. So in a way, I'm going to answer or think about that question of representation obliquely through a different way into Arab urbanism today. I'm reminded, Ahmed Kanna say today, of his study, Dubai, the city as corporation, as a city-state created, controlled by holding companies that have built its mega towers, its enclaves, its retail malls, its ports, its artificial islands. And of course, there are many, many other examples, including those that have been mentioned again and again today. The Solidaire project, the Suez downtown project in Cairo, and many, many others that you've seen images of. So the centrality of the corporation, in a certain sense, to the city is something that's hovered behind some of these discussions, but hasn't been directly addressed. And it's actually the history of the corporation, not as a business unit, but as a political entity, and one with a long history, is one that I've been thinking about recently. I'm going to briefly sketch some of that and bring it back to the question of the city. Of course, one doesn't have to bring the corporation back to the city, because the corporation originally was the city, or at least the town. The town as a corporation was one of the original ways in which corporate bodies, entities that could act collectively, could survive the death of their founders and so on. That was one of the original purposes of the corporation, of the powers of incorporation, just as the university was one of the other original forms of the corporation. It was a form that was taken over for other ends, and it was actually taken over initially for other ends through the process of colonialism. The Dutch the English and the Dutch East India companies, the Dutch West India Company that colonized Manhattan's colonial beginnings as a form of organized through powers of incorporation. And of course, from that beginning in forms of long distance, the control of long distance trade and overseas colonies, it gets transformed, particularly in the 19th and early 20th century, into what is going to become the modern business firm, as joint stock companies are established to build canals, to build railroads, to build oil industries, to develop real estate through land speculation companies, and all the forms of the modern business firm in the 20th century. Very briefly, I just want to suggest that we think of the corporation, I'm going to put in a different word for it in a minute, as a specific means of controlling the future. And what is significant about all those things, beginning with the colony, moving to the railroad, going on to global oil industries, is that they lay out durable structures, engineering works, if you like. In the case of the railroad, that would be the lines, the trusses, the viaducts, the terminals, the rolling stock. Complete, of course, with the labor forces that build them and run them, and the forms of policing that keep them durable, because it's not just the materials, but the operation that has to be durable. And that future, that durable future, is a promise of a flow of revenue over 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. That flow of revenue, in other words, is not revenue just from a single exchange or a set of market transactions. It is something over years and decades. And what is distinctive of the corporation as a form is that those who promote and who control that future over a decade or two, can take it and sell it in the present. The durability means that the value of the enterprise doesn't rest in the steel or the iron or the concrete or whatever that it's built out of, but the value rests in the revenue stream that is discounted to reflect the uncertainty and sold in the present in the forms of stocks or bonds, in many other forms. And of course, the selling and the trading in that future becomes speculative. So you've got a durable structure, a built structure that has these qualities of durability, and out of that is created a present that has qualities of speculation and uncertainty. And there's a certain relationship between the future and the present that we can trace if we take this more material way of thinking about the worlds we build, traced in terms of very particular, very specific modes of both engineering, of building durable structures, but also turning them through this process into forms of speculative investment in the present. Now, there's a technical term for this process, capitalization. And I think the term capitalization has got to be extended more broadly. One or two scholars have started doing this, and it's an Ambichla, among others, into, I think, a much more useful term than the kinds of terms that we have been used to throwing out and we're throwing out today to somehow explain our contemporary political economic condition. Terms such as globalization, neoliberalism, global capitalism, the market, a whole set of terms that have been invoked in talks that we all use to refer to what seems to be distinctive about our world today. I think this notion of capitalization, of the changing techniques for building out durable futures and capitalizing them in the present, is a much more useful term, partly because it connects us back to the colonial histories where these techniques were first developed, and partly because we can stop seeing what we do today as so radically different from that time, except perhaps they were bracketed in the middle decades of the 20th century by other more dominant forms of organizing economic life that previously we were, as it were, under the rule of capitalization, and we've come as a process, as a more general social process, and we're coming back to be under it again today. Now, so I said I would talk briefly about the corporation. I actually want you to think in terms of a process, one that I think is central to the architectural, to the built environment as much as it was once to railroads and canals and other things, a process of capitalization. A process, not a thing. And then the next thing I want to do is, while I've been stressing so far that the durability, the builtness, the engineered nature of the kinds of structures, whether railroads or oil industries or urban developments, that are the vehicles of capitalization, the modes of capitalization, those are equally, if you like, paper worlds. They are equally built at every point. From forms of inscription, of reference, of calculation, all those actually very different activities that sort of get lumped together under notions of representation or meaning. I wish I had time. I'll be very quick. I give you an example, an illustration of this. Probably one could come up with wonderful examples from the world of architecture and construction, and I'll gesture to some in a moment. But let me give you one that I have a more developed sense of, and the one that sort of helped develop the corporation as a political form 100 years or so ago, 150 years ago, the railroad. When you were building railroads, of course you had to build a material structure in ways I referred to, but you actually had to put together complex new worlds of calculation as well. You had to calculate potential passenger miles, volumes of freight, inclines on the gradient at which tracks were laid, the stress that would be the trusses of a bridge were under, every kind of calculation. And of course, journals came into being to make and to publicize those calculations. But then as this constructed but also calculated world of iron and steel and many other forms of both material and more paper forms, as it came into being, as it became a world of speculation, you also had to start reassuring the investors to whom you were now selling this future in the present that those calculations were reliable. So what you find is that the journals of engineering, of railroad engineering of the late 19th century, gradually transform into financial journals of one sort or another. The main such journal was published by a man called Poor. And he began publishing it initially as a monthly journal, then as an annual. It was called Poor's Manual of the Railroads, and he then expanded it from just railroad corporations, which it was about 95% of corporations on the New York Stock Exchange in the late 19th century anyway. But as the corporate form was used for other purposes, Poor began to publish these in other forms. And then he got together with a man called Standard, and they began publishing this financial information other kinds of ways and developing the first value-weighted stock indices. And you had Standard & Poor's, the S&P 500. And that paper world of engineering calculation, of projection of revenues and so on, gradually became something around which, in the middle decades of the 20th century, we actually were expected to live our lives. Because the projections of what was happening and the very movement of these indexes then became much larger political indices about what government should do and not do. And in fact, around the 1930s and 1940s, governments in the US and Britain and elsewhere took this new paper world and made out of it something that economists had never believed in the existence of before, namely the economy. No economist talked about an object before this period, and I think it's one of the reasons they didn't is because they didn't have these forms of calculation available to imagine a future that could be projected and measured and so on. So when I talk about a paper world, a world of representation and calculation and numbers, I'm talking about an enormous range of forms of manipulation of data and production of information. But what they end up constructing is something as vast as the economy in the form of this system of representations by which we all came to be governed in the middle decades of the 20th century. So I hope that example of the railroads gives you some idea of how one could connect together the building of durable structures laid out in the future, laid out in such a way that the future they promise can be capitalized and sold in the present, to the fact that at every point that is a process of inscription, of calculation, and that those forms of calculation can be built together into something that seems as large and inevitable and as obvious as, for example, the national economy. I think we need to do the same kind of work, and I'm sure it's been done in all kinds of separate ways, but maybe not perhaps under this larger theme, for thinking about not the railroad example, but other forms of built structure, other forms of durability that work in these kinds of ways. So I think that means I've already spoke for 20 minutes, is that? Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting clock. It's, I just want to make 4 points to sort of bring this back to partly to sort of where we are in more general forms today, but then specifically to the question of Arab cities. First, I've talked about railways, and I've suggested that we could also talk about cities, but capitalization is something much, much bigger than that. And today, I think one of the ways to think about those processes that we otherwise refer to as neoliberalism or the market, all kinds of rather unuseful terms, I think could be thought of as the capitalization of life itself. That's to say, all kinds of long-term structures, the kinds of long-term structures that can be, or long-term processes that can be capitalized and turned into investments in the present are not just railroads or oil industries or even apartment buildings, but the very trajectory of a human life, so that things like one's health care, one's education, one's provision for retirement, things that were all built and provided for, as it were, as public infrastructures and previously funded through general taxation, are now privatized, as we say, but we should perhaps say capitalized, transformed into future streams of income, the money we will all pay in the future, and made available to investment in the present. And of course, that's happened very directly with our habitats, our modes of protecting ourselves and living, in the sense that what mortgages do and home equity loans do is turn our very ability to live into, again, a capitalized future that can be sold and collateralized and speculated in and so on. So something that began with the building of colonies and railroads is now something that spreads right through our life. It's still the case, however, that by far the most significant form of these modes of capitalization are forms of real estate, are forms of property. In the advanced industrialized countries, about half of the country's capital, somewhere like the US or Europe, exists in the form of productive assets, but the other half is residential real estate. And of course, that is simply another example where what has been sold is not shares, but the amount of money you pay over a lifetime in the mortgage in this speculated future that has been offered to you. To move this back to the Arab cities, if residential real estate is 50% of wealth in countries like the US, in much of the Arab world, it is vastly more. I don't have figures, I'm afraid, available. And I think if one did have figures, one would want to be careful to make a distinction between the different ways in which it operates. So, for example, we've been talking about the Arab cities in general and with very specific cases, but I think one can draw some differences between, for example, non-oil states, that's to say states that acquire benefits from being in an oil region and from the reinvestment of oil revenue, but are not themselves significant producers of oil. So that would include, obviously, Lebanon that we've talked about, Cairo or Egypt, but also Dubai. Dubai is part of the Emirates, which is an oil state, but 97% of that comes from Abu Dhabi. Dubai has almost very, very small amounts of oil. And making those kinds of distinctions and thinking about them in architectural terms between the theme parks of Dubai and the rather different, perhaps, kinds of architecture of Abu Dhabi is important. In what particular ways does this thinking in terms of the building of the building of durable futures that become speculative in the present play out in the urban order of the Arab world? So, thanks to those oil revenues, whether enjoyed directly as an oil producer or indirectly through the investment of them locally, most of the well-to-do in the Arab world have not been forced to build their wealth through the rather messy, short-term, competitive world of material things, of factories, let's say, of the productive life of factories, which are complicated things and are redundant pretty soon and not the sensible way to go about reproducing wealth. As one knows, if one has wealth, one wants to reproduce it by turning it very quickly into forms of rent that will generate income in a much more reliable way over a future. And that's why real estate appears always alongside oil revenues as the thing that accompanies them. It is the most logical and straightforward way to take extraordinary revenues from oil and turn them into a long-term future that can be capitalized in the present. I think it's important, and this is a point David Sims has made in the books that have been referred to early, to relate that to another aspect of some of the region's cities, but again, not all, and that is the aspect of desert ecology. If you build rapidly large cities in which the expansionary fringe of those cities is desert, as tends to be the case not only in the cities of the Gulf, but also, for example, in Cairo, what happens is that potential development land is actually almost entirely in the hands of the state. That's very different from probably most other cities of the world, where potential development land on the fringes of the city would already be privately owned. So that means one gets a certain relationship between this impulse to transform to manufacture much larger possibilities for future wealth through the speculative building of real estate with a form of politics where the state itself has this extraordinary access to sites for development. And so while we talk about sort of powerful families and things like that, I think that particular relationship between deserts, the state or the powerful families that claim ownership of the desert, and the pushing of revenues into the building out of these durable structures that we call real estate has to be understood as a very central part of that dynamic. So let me just finally return to the theme of representation. As I suggested at the beginning, to me, the problem with any attempt to relate or to place architecture in a problem of representation isn't because we don't want to think about works of meaning that can be done, either because the building itself is to produce meaning or because the building itself is to reflect a meaning, some national cultural meaning that already exists. It's the ease with which we slip into the assumption that there is the building on the one hand and what it represents or what it means on the other. And I don't know why we keep doing that, because we saw, as I said, exactly from so many of the slides and the descriptions that in our actual sort of lived worlds and built worlds, that's not the way it works. We are not dealing with two separate axes, one of which one could call the built and the other which one could call the representational. And I think the advantage of placing architecture in this larger history of capitalization that I've tried to sketch is that not simply that I think that is a much better term than the neoliberal or anything else, as I've said, for making sense of our contemporary condition and for the absolute centrality of architectural processes in that contemporary economic condition. But because, if we think back to that example of the railroad, or if we think of parallel examples in architecture, at every single point one is involved in these processes of forms of calculation, of inscription, of planning, of drawing, that have to be understood in relation to the fact that one is trying to build a durable future and at the same time persuade people in the presence of the durability of that. So it's not just any old form of calculation or meaning. It works in a very specific way in relation to the role of forms of structure in constructing the forms of economic, of material life with which we live. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Just one or two questions, and then we'll open it up. Nora. It's very interesting to hear you say that we are projecting durable futures to be capitalized in the present. And what does that mean in the era of climate change, where everybody knows that the futures that we're projecting are not durable? So that moment, are we at that moment where, and we architects are completely involved in this projection of non-durable futures, actually, somehow?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think each project, whether it's some form of transportational infrastructure or some form of urban structure, has to do this work of constructing the future that people must believe in and accept the calculations for, if they're to be persuaded to buy shares in it or to invest in that apartment or whatever. But of course, that's a very unstable process because the future doesn't always work out, and because the speculation in the potential value of that future, the buying and selling of real estate, apartments, or shares and companies and so on, can very easily be driven by unrealistic expectations. And so what had to happen, and this is just a sort of parallel for thinking about the questions of climate today, what happened, and this led between, over the centuries of colonizing corporations, but then intensively from the 1870s onwards, to crash and crisis and crash and crisis, right through, of course, until the great one of 1929. And people thought, this can't happen anymore. We're going to have to stabilize this by, as it were, providing a background, a frame, against which all these individual speculations and projections of futures can be measured more reliably than what they themselves are saying or what those calculations say. That frame was the economy. That's why economists had to invent the economy in the mid-20th century, I think, to sort of establish a set of parameters against which all these individual claims. So one way to think about the point you raise about the possibility of catastrophic climate collapse within the lifetime of the buildings that are now going up in the Gulf and elsewhere, is that we sort of have to do that again and build not an economy, something that is now only a residual part of our political discourse in many ways, but seriously that other frame of calculation, call it the environment, against which the claims of the speculators can be measured. And of course that's part of what's being done in campaigns showing, for example, that oil companies base their current share value on reserves of oil that, if they were ever produced, would make that catastrophic future inevitable. And so trying to provide a different background, a different set of parameters of calculation against which the value of shares of oil companies ought to be recalculated. And I think that's a useful way to think about how the knowledge of the future threats to the climate could be placed as those parameters against which decisions on around our more sort of speculative 10, 20, 30-year investments should be placed.
I wanted to maybe also build on that and ask, in relation to the catastrophic possibilities in the future that are closer, that we are witnessing, actually entire cities being destroyed. And it reminds me of a conversation that I once had with Senan Abdelqader, and also in relation to what Laura was saying, architecture being of representation being active, is that it requires also the possibility of planning a future. And in a context where, and in relation to the conversation I had with Senan, where the possibility of participating in the planning of a future is very much embedded within an identity politics that excludes or includes a certain group of people. And in that sense, we are also left with a generation of architects knowing that in a way that also Senan participated in that the plans that we are working on will actually never be fulfilled because we sit on one side of the wall, or because we are granted or not granted access to property in general. I wondered if there might be another set or maybe a tint of for the conversation in this kind of context.
Yeah, that's an enormously important point, and of course we've been reminded in Senan's paper and in several of the others about the way in which threats to the ability to live together collectively are not just things that might come to us all in 50 or 100 years' time because of what might happen to the global climate, but are lived with every day because of walls being built or entire cities being destroyed. And I guess the great challenge is to bring those two kinds of threat together in one same sort of image of the world and of how we build the world. And that I suppose it can be very difficult for those who are thinking on a sort of planetary level and thinking that we might be heading down a path where the very possibilities of ordinary human life don't become viable, to see and understand adequately the situation of those who are confronting completely impossible futures right now. But I think that is the work. Those two things have to be brought together. And one of the gratifying things about the climate march, which I and I'm sure many of you participated in New York in September, was that it wasn't simply called a climate march. And of course there were similar marches and protests all over the world on the same day. It was called the Climate Justice March. And so I was actually drafted into the Palestinian section of that march very happily. But an enormous range of causes and concerns, some as immediate as the situation in Palestine immediately after what had happened in Gaza the months before, along with a whole range of other political groups were brought together under the umbrella of climate. And I think that's not to say, ignore your conflicts because it's really all about climate, but to realize that one had to build those kinds of coalitions among different forces and communities to work effectively.
Before opening it up, I wanted to end on an optimistic note. I will be the optimist tonight, which is, as architects, what we do is project the future. I mean, we constantly, so given the responsibility of building, the material building, the responsibility it has towards climate change, I think that we have a big role to play in terms of projecting a future that doesn't go there somehow. But I'd like to open it up to the audience.
There's one over there.
Adrian.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I thought it was such an important intervention. I appreciate it enormously. I've just come back from an event in Berlin looking at the Anthropocene and actually going over very, very similar kinds of questions around climate models, the IPCC scenarios, and how they're being used with insurance companies actually to try to work out how to organize risk. But my question is on something that you mentioned but didn't really get a chance to elaborate on, which is the issue of capitalization and the way that it's not just about architectural cities, it's about souls in some sense. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on what you think some of the political ramifications are for this idea of indebtedness to the future. I mean, Maurizio Lazzarato, for example, has this book, the Indebted Man, and I think is a kind of a contemporary figure of the way governmentality and also management of human beings works today. I think it's extremely important.
Yeah, I agree. I think Lazzarato's book and work and others of that Italian school are enormously important for helping us to think about these questions of debt and the ways in which, as I think he's as one of those who puts it this way, the whereas before we were put to work in all kinds of occupations, we may or may not be lucky enough to have jobs or jobs we can live off, but we're increasingly put to work as debtors. After World War II, to take the example of the US, there was essentially zero household debt. And then oil companies and automobile companies terrified about the prospect of the amount of oil they were discovering in the Middle East, and they were desperately trying to prevent the development of the oil in the Middle East, but some work on the other end by increasing the need for it in the US, and created an automobile culture for us in all kinds of ways, so that then this form, we began to work as people who had to pay off auto loans and then home equity loans. And of course today, just to bring this closer to home, the largest form of household debt in the US, and then of course there were credit cards and all the kinds of ways they could be transformed from an elite into a mass product in ways one could talk about. But then the most recent stage of that, and this of course is spreading to where you teach as well, is indebtedness to pay for education. So that student loans are now the largest single form They've now replaced auto loans and credit card and loans, the largest form of unsecured household debt. So I think we have to be, try and connect together these different ways in which we live in debt and organize our lives towards the repayment of the debts that we take on. That is absolutely central to real estate, to architecture, to the speculative world that can be very easily part of, because we get drawn into spending 30 years repaying debt on apartments and houses that is tied into exactly that same system. That's how our lives have been transformed. The fact that wages of the majority of people here and in many other parts of the world have been absolutely flat for 50 years is because what we used to receive as salaries and as incomes and as wages, we no longer get. Instead, we get the opportunity to borrow that money in order to maintain levels of living and then do the additional work of paying off that debt. But it's not only a thing of the sort of first world. I mean, there was a mention this morning of the Sayyida Zainab Children's Park and the way in which it turned out to be a vehicle for drawing small craftsmen into systems of debt. And of course we know, and there were references in the question to experiments in Bangladesh and now all over the world to take systems of credit and turn them into microcredit, turn them into devise very clever ways to get those who've managed to live their life insulated from debt, living with forms of building houses without going into debt, for example, except for the informal debt to one's neighbors who help one, as Suad Amiry was talking about, and in all kinds of ways avoiding this terrible threat of debt. And now that last barrier where so much of the people of the global south have fought over a century or more to stop banking, stop credit systems from taking over their lives by things like fighting for laws that prevented their houses or their fields from being used as collateral for debt, are now being told that this is their salvation. If they can only get into this system of debt that the rest, and that's what microcredit is around the world. It's a way of replacing other forms of self-help and of mutual credit with one that allows credit institutions to work at the level of not just everyday lives here, but everyday lives throughout the world.
Thanks. So, no, thanks. Great talk. Yeah.
Thank you.
Much to discuss. But on this topic, it was sort of interesting to think out loud about it a little bit more vis-a-vis what sometimes, we could call conventionally symbolism, but let's maybe call it something like a structure of feeling or something like that, and specifically associated with debt. And I wonder what your thoughts...
With debt?
With debt, yeah. Mm-hmm. Like those early business organizations were called trusts often, and in fact, economic theory has long associated emotional effects like trust with the political economic structures you're describing. And to the extent that something like architecture deals in poetics and symbolics, I wanted to invite you to speculate a little bit about the relation between something like the poetics or poesis of making cities and the structures you're describing.
The process of capitalization of building durable futures and turning them into speculative presence, I don't think characterizes all building or all architecture, and that's why, for example, I wanted to draw something of a distinction, if you like, between Dubai and Abu Dhabi, the emirate that knew it had very little oil and therefore had to transform itself into a port city and into a city of speculative real estate, versus the city that had the city-state, the emirate that had no concerns in the near future, in the near decades, about the availability of oil revenues, and therefore for whom the building of the architectural projects didn't have to, as they did in Dubai, didn't have to satisfy an immediate sort of return need for revenue. That's probably a bit of a simplification. I don't know enough about the specific architectural histories of the two cities other than what I've picked up listening to papers and reading books like we've heard today. But I think I'm not trying to suggest that every time some great building goes up, it has to be understood in relation to this. What one's often trying to build is something, and particularly when it is state, where the client is the state, is, one's trying to build forms of family and state power, not immediate returns on wealth, and therefore the way in which the symbolic and the poetic can work can be different. You don't have to immediately persuade people that they are buying into, as one does with certain kinds of extraordinary overwrought structures in Dubai, for example, that the one was buying into this financial future in a very specific way. So that's just a sort of general caveat that I don't want to reduce all forms of meaning and expression associated with forms of building and forms in life in general to this process of capitalization. I just want to put it there because it is so central to the way our lives are being organized, and it is so absent from the way, not the way we think, but the way we connect these things together. But as you say, economists themselves have long thought about these kinds of questions. John Maynard Keynes says in this wonderful passage that I like to quote that he says two things. The first thing he says, it is durable structures that connect the economic future to our present. Laid out exactly the argument I've laid out. And then, of course, goes to help and construct the answer to it. And he needs an answer because those durable structures aren't durable enough to actually secure our present, and therefore we've had 1929, we've had all kinds of problems. And the reason we've had that is because of our emotions. We are subject, as human beings, to these collective panics. And the reason in Maynard Keynes's view that we needed this structure of calculation that is going to come to be called the economy is to stop us stop us being carried away by our emotions, to stop us falling for these panics, these moods of the market moving up and down. So, economists have a long history in the engineering of our emotions, just as I guess architects have as well. And I think it's interesting to connect these things together.
We fail, though.
Hi, thanks also. Really, really inspiring how economy can be for us. And I'm asking this question on a comment that the discussion here about conflict and the economy of conflict, and also if you can speculate again, what do you think may change to economical plans such as the Marshall Plan in reconstruction of the parts of the world, especially the countries which are in war? So would that mean, because being higher than conflict, I'm just thinking, since you mentioned that a new economical scenario will have to be invented, maybe it is invented, would it melt the kind of large projects like the Marshall Plan for reconstruction of cities and countries?
I wouldn't use the Marshall Plan as the model for a couple of reasons. I wrote a bit about the Marshall Plan in my book on the history of oil. The largest single expenditure of Marshall Plan funds was on oil facilities, building oil refineries and subsidizing the price of Middle Eastern oil. Again, the same problem, that was going to be all this oil in the Middle East that the oil majors were going to find it very hard not to produce. What was presented, of course, and did indeed in some practical ways contribute to reconstruction, was actually driven by a set of broader concerns about the building out of future structures of energy consumption. The other main concern of the Marshall Plan was of bringing the American corporate form to Europe. And it was run by senior American business managers, and who worked very hard to introduce this particular American form of corporate organization across Europe, and to stymie experiments being put forward in France, in Italy, and elsewhere for very different ways of building futures through the control of enterprises in terms of the role of workers in the enterprise and many other things. So, but I know I don't mean to quibble about the Marshall Plan. Do we need another one? Well, I don't actually think that things are probably going to work, because you only get things like Marshall Plans if it turns out that it's going to be really good for the oil companies or really good for somebody else. So we shouldn't hold out for that. And I don't think, I think in many cases the actual costs involved with reorganizing lives to address global climate are not as enormous as they might be imagined. I mean, obviously that there are huge issues and concerns, but there are also some relatively simple ones, like the pricing of renewable electricity versus electricity from non-renewable sources. It doesn't cost very much to suddenly make coal completely uneconomic.
Clara, do you want to?
Thank you for a thought-provoking talk. I was very taken by a sentence you used, the capitalization of life itself. It made me think about Giorgio Agamben's notion of bare life, or the banalization of life itself. And I was wondering if the two conditions, the capitalization and the banalization of life itself, could be used at least to partially explain the plight of Arab cities today, including the conditions of immediate violence and destruction that Nora referred to, or the more perhaps the farther away condition of climate change and destruction. Then my question is about education. If those conditions define the world and the particularities of the Arab world specifically, what does it mean for what we do here in an institution such as Columbia in general and in this school in particular? What's our role through education?
I suppose I ought to answer that in a positive, and
it's Friday night. You can.
Yeah. Okay. No. I think the talk we had from Magda this afternoon about what's happening with architectural education at AUC in Cairo, I found enormously inspiring, and I think what's inspiring about it, and I'm reminded of what Lila said earlier this afternoon about her mother, is that it's not about telling people what to do or education in that sense. It's about people who are fortunate enough to have things like a university education, going out and learning how it is that ordinary people build and rebuild cities. That reference to the, and I'll have to ask her the percentage again of Cairo that is informal. Was it 78% of Cairo that could be measured in one way or another as informally housed? Not all of it, of course, self-built, but involving all kinds of community and other small-scale work. And so, like so many others, I think many of the solutions to our cities are in what people already do themselves, but are so stymied and prevented from doing by unequal access to resources, of which education can be a part, but I don't think any sense that we've got to somehow use the privileged position of the university to start telling ordinary people what to do, or start going out to save them with microloans or other forms of credit, or any of the other things that have occupied so much of the efforts to intervene in cities of the global south. That's not to say that we just leave people themselves. Obviously, there's all kinds of practical things that are needed. Sites and services need to be provided in many cases, and I don't mean to be glib about it. But I do think forms of education that do this kind of work that we just saw illustrated at AUC, that force students of architecture to engage with the actual solutions that people are devising themselves is enormously important.
In the context of the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, obviously there are some cities which are in the throes of chaos, nihilistic kind of urban chaos, let's say, and there are other cities which are booming. And in actual fact, the two events are in some ways related, because there's also a flight of capital, let's say, from some areas where capital might normally have gone, for example, Egypt, to places like Oman or Salalah, for example, or Dubai currently has a property boom that's mirroring what used to happen in the past, and so does London as a consequence. Mm-hmm. My question is really, what is the blowback in terms of the Arab Spring for the boom cities of the Gulf, let's say the Dubai, Doha, sort of the more prosperous Gulf cities, as opposed to the kind of cities which are being left behind?
That's a very good question. I wonder about the notion of Cairo, for example, being left behind because Gulf capital has fled to London or to Doha or places. Given the kinds of projects that so much of that Gulf capital was spent on. You saw the pictures of the golf courses and the gated communities that have sprawled on the outer edges of Cairo and of course along the coast of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea and everywhere else. The building has been on the desert fringe, and it hasn't been building to serve the majority of the population. So, of course, there are other places where the consequences have been much worse and much more disruptive at the specific level of investment and things like that. But I wouldn't assume that the absence of that kind of capital flowing into forms of grandiose real estate development for a small part of the population is going to be a concern. As to what's going to happen in London or Doha or Oman, where the capital now flows, I guess we're going to see more of what we've seen before, and we already know what's happening in London in terms of real estate prices and so on. So it is, of course, this problem of the way urban planning, investment laws, and so much else are organized to make in every country of the world just about real estate this extraordinarily attractive and profitable place to put money and earn remarkable returns on it. And I don't think one can blame those with these large amounts of capital in themselves for seeking to do that so much as to think about what are those policies on forms of investment, on levels of taxation, on the write-off of the tax write-off of mortgage payments, of everything else that continues to make cities these places of speculative construction rather than places of building of communities. But the more specific answers to your question in terms of London or Doha, I think it's good to raise and to think about. I don't have answers to.
What I mean is that, for example, in Saudi Arabia, they raised public sector salaries enormously over the past few years. does that necessarily translate into architecture? Meaning, is there a possibility that better urban spaces, public spaces, could therefore be created as a consequence of the requirement to address the urban and the population as a whole?
Well, I don't think those kinds of answers of having better governed and more responsive forms of authority are connected directly to levels of income. It's very popular to think that governments become more answerable to their populations once they become a little wealthier. I don't know if this was the implication of your question, but that's one way of reading what might happen in places like Saudi Arabia, and that somehow if you just sort of develop a big enough middle class, that middle class will want to make the country more democratic or more responsive. Middle classes have never supported democracy. Historically, that's not how democracy came about. Certain forms of representation came about, but the forms of popular democracy came from other sources. And it came about largely because those who controlled access to wealth and power found themselves in positions where the reproduction of their wealth had to pass through ordinary lives, had to pass through the lives of people who they wanted to put to work making things and doing things in various ways. And that happened in many parts of Europe at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. It's happened more recently in parts of East Asia. You need that that source of vulnerability, the vulnerability that comes about when you can no longer reproduce your comfortable position through investing in real estate, but suddenly have to do things like opening factories or other kinds of forms of circulation of wealth that actually make you very dependent on a population who become directly responsible for the creation of your wealth. That's the thing about real estate. By and large, it doesn't work that way. There are, of course, large labor forces involved at the construction phase, but not afterwards. So will the growth of larger, more prosperous middle classes in some of these countries translate into governments that are more vulnerable to their populations? It doesn't seem to me that it necessarily happens that way.
Magda. Thank you very much. Very quick question, actually, on capitalization and materiality as they come back to kind of echo some of earlier conversations on capital and materialism. And I know this is a tricky ground to go to, but what would be the kind of distinctions you draw between capitalization, capital, materialism, and materiality in the sense that they're deployed operatively in what you're proposing?
I think I'm going to have to let you all get some dinner before I get round to figuring out a way. Capitalization is a way of taking theories of capital and relating to them to the specific forms of life that developed after Marx wrote Capital. He did live long enough to see the rise of the joint stock company, which he referred to as the abolition of capitalism, because he thought it had led to something that was totally different. But not really to see this world that, although it existed in its colonial forms in the 17th, 18th century and into the 19th century, really took off after the 1870s, where it became possible not just to build the kinds of things that Marx thought of as emblematic and as central to capitalism, namely a factory, but on which you would calculate returns on an annual basis and project maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years into the future. But as I say, these durable structures in which you could purport to show a return going forward over 10, 20, 30 years and then sell that in the present. It was something that didn't happen with the world of factories that, by and large, that Marx was involved in. So, but in some ways, I'm not the only one to talk about these questions of capitalization. I mentioned the work of Nitzan and Bichler, and there's many others who are taking it up. But it is an attempt to move the study of questions of political economy, if you like, into a concern with the built, the material, the durable, in a quite concrete and located way that sort of largely disappeared from so many older studies. It was there in Marx's own work, but it disappeared from later work. So I think that's the difference. It's not just a study of capital as something that can be looked at in the aggregate or in the abstract, but it's a way of thinking about specific projects, specific modes of organizing, futures and presents and so on, and gets us away from, as I say, those more abstract notions, the neoliberal and so on, that I don't think have been particularly helpful.
All right. On this note, I think we'll go to dinner. Thank you, Tim.
Is that okay? We got a bit away from the Arab city, I'm afraid.